We will begin with a presentation by Nadia Abuelezam, followed by Patricia McCoy in the law school, Andrea Vicini in the School of Theology and Ministry, and then Mary Walsh, where's Mary, from the Lynch School. And Nadia, of course, is in the Connell School of Nursing. So Nadia, you're going to kick it off. Do you want to stand behind the podium?
Sorry?
You want to stand behind the podium?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Thank you for having me. My name is Nadia Abuelezam. I'm a second-year assistant professor in the Connell School of Nursing. And while this is the fourth time this has been offered, and I've only been here for 2 years, I've actually attended every single one of these up until this point as an adjunct before, so very honored to be asked to present today. I'm an epidemiologist in the School of Nursing, so I was trained in public health. And I was actually a math undergraduate major, so I actually think a lot about things from a quantitative perspective. And there's going to be some of that today in my talk, but I won't scare you with any math equations. I will keep those sort of behind the scenes, and we can talk about them if you're interested. But I'm going to speak about HIV and the process of doing good public health work, both domestically and globally. So what we were trained to do in the School of Public Health that I attended was to first identify a problem. And that's pretty easy to do. We see a lot of problems, both domestically and globally, that we want to address. And the next task that we have assigned to us is to actually develop a solution and then to provide evidence that that solution works. And after we have a solution and we've developed some evidence that that solution works, we're tasked with testing that solution on a small group of people, often, to prove the efficacy and safety of that solution. And this is what we think of as efficacy, and this is often where we get into conversations about ethics and what is ethical in terms of human subjects research and trials of that sort. Now, once we have a solution and we've proved that it's efficacious, we're then tasked to rolling that solution out to everyone who has a need for it. And this is where we prove the effectiveness of that solution. And then you can pat yourself on the back that you've done some good, and hopefully you've done that in an ethical manner, and you can go on with your life. Now, let me give you an example of something in the past where this process was sort of followed, and that's syphilis in the 1990s. In the 1930s, syphilis incidence, although it is increasing now as well, syphilis in the 1930s, the incidence of it was increasing, and it was sort of being discovered that untreated syphilis was leaving people with lifelong issues. And this was really scary. So scientists had an inkling that penicillin might be thought to treat syphilis. Now, they had been using mercury and bismuth, but that was only working in about 30% of cases. So they really needed a solution that was going to affect more than just those 30% of people. So they decided to test the solution. And this was done, again, started in 1932, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Black men were enrolled in the South, and they were enrolled in 1932. And they were actually enrolled for 40 years, and I'm going to talk about why that's problematic in a second. And you've noticed I've crossed out the word ethically because this is sort of the example in public health of bad public health research. Because penicillin was actually found to be effective in 1945. And yet these men, these black men in the South, were kept in this trial without access to penicillin until 1972. And many of these men suffered greatly from their illness and their disease and were never offered the cure to their disease. And this was for the sake of science, for the sake of understanding the prognosis and the natural history of syphilis at that time. A few other notes that an apology was not issued to these men or their families until 1997 by the Clinton administration. And this is really a stain on our public health history here in the United States. So this is sort of my way of saying that, yes, there is a process to doing public health, but there is a a good way and a bad way of doing public health. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how I conceive of doing good in public health, specifically with my skill set and my interests. And something that I had the opportunity to research in my doctoral work, and before that even, is HIV. Many of you know that we have a global HIV epidemic. In 2016, it's estimated that 37 million people were infected with HIV, and that's a very large number to wrap your head around. And there were about 2 million new infections last year, and about 1 million deaths. And so if you think about this from a historical perspective, we've actually done a lot of good at reducing the incidence of HIV over time. So this graph is showing you time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we're showing number of new infections. And what you can see is that the number of new infections increased up until the mid-1990s, and then proceeded to decrease. And one of the main reasons for that decrease is antiretroviral therapy, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. But I also want to note that there's a red dot all the way down there in 2020. And that red dot is the UNAIDS target for where we should be by 2020 in terms of incidence. And what should be sort of ringing bells in your mind right now is that the slope of the line that we're currently on is not going to reach that target. And so what I'm going to talk to you today about is doing some simulations, some mathematical modeling, to try to see if there's any way that we could curve that curve down to the target in 2020. The good news is that we have many interventions and solutions to HIV. The first one that was developed and that is used extensively is quick and accurate HIV tests. They weren't quick when they were first developed, but they're relatively quick now. And so people can go into the clinic and essentially find out if they're HIV positive within an hour or so. And that is a cause for celebration. At first, it was sort of a 3-week turnaround. People had to come back to the clinic to get their diagnosis. And so now we're able to test people and figure out if they're HIV positive almost immediately. The second major thing that we have in our arsenal is antiretroviral therapy. So antiretroviral therapy is a combination of a number of different drugs that target multiple points in the HIV virus's life cycle. And they're supposed to be used in combination because HIV mutates rapidly. And so we need multiple drugs in order to prevent sort of mutations within the body. And what was so amazing about these drugs was that not only did they prolong people's lives with HIV, but they were recently found to also prevent transmission of HIV to HIV-negative partners or people who shared needles with HIV-positive people, and not just reduce the risk of transmission, but nearly eliminate the risk of transmission. It was a 96% reduction of transmission if someone was suppressed on antiretroviral therapy. That's better than any vaccine we currently have or have on the horizon developed for HIV. So I'm going to talk specifically in my modeling work about the combination of testing and treatment, but I also want to mention that there are many other tools in our toolbox that we have to prevent HIV spread, but also to help people live longer with HIV. Some of these might be familiar to you, behavioral interventions like reducing the number of partners you might have, encouraging people to be faithful to the partners that they have, but also biomedical interventions like male circumcision, which reduces the risk of infection for an HIV-negative man by 56%. Female and male condoms are still one of the most effective ways to reduce HIV transmission. So these are all tools in our toolbox. And while we have many tools, it's unclear how we combine those tools together to get that incidence curve to go down to reach our 2020 UNAIDS goal. So while we have many solutions, it's unclear how we combine them in the real world. What is happening now in the HIV world is community randomized trials. And these are happening in sub-Saharan Africa primarily. So many of you might be familiar with a randomized control trial where the unit of randomization is the individual. We randomize people to intervention or control. In a community randomized trial, we're randomizing full communities of people to different combinations of interventions. And the ultimate goal is to reduce HIV incidence in these communities. There are 4 very large community randomized trials currently being underdone in sub-Saharan Africa right now. And I've put up here one of the sort of structural guidelines for one of those community randomized trials. You'll notice that there's 21 communities involved in this trial. That's a population of 1.2 million people that are being sort of involved in this large trial to assess how the combination of testing and treatment will impact incidence in their communities. So while this is wonderful that these are going on, I would argue that there are some ethical and also logistical issues with doing these community randomized trials. First, they're extremely expensive to run. You're talking about having to care for, but also having to ensure lifelong treatment for 1.2 million people in these communities just for one of these trials. It's also quite difficult to manage such large numbers of people. It's difficult and exhausting for community members who have to come back to the clinic every so often to be assessed. It really does put a toll on the communities that are being sort of quote-unquote tested in these trials. And from a statistical standpoint, they're really a mess to analyze because there's a lot of contamination that can happen with people traveling between communities and say, oh, hey, they're getting free condoms over there. Why don't I go to that community? And that really messes with the randomization that you employ at the beginning of these studies. So if I've convinced you of anything, I've hopefully convinced you that there's a framework for studying HIV and other public health interventions. And this framework leads us from evidence to effectiveness. And evidence involves observational studies, like cohort studies, and then experimental trials lead us to efficacy through randomized control trials. And eventually, we need to get to the translational research to proving that these interventions work in the real world, in communities. And that's through the use of community randomized trials. Where my work falls is actually at this effectiveness point, and that's through the use of mathematical models that aim to take data from real-world interventions and experiment with that data from a mathematical lens. And there's a lot of different definitions for what a mathematical model is, and I promised you I wouldn't show you any math, so there's no math on this slide. But essentially, it's a simplified but quantitative description of reality. And for those of you who are mathematically inclined, this often involves differential equations or algorithms or simply, if you want to look at it, as a black box that we put data into and we get data out of. But I want to distinguish these models from statistical models. So mathematical models aim and require that we elucidate the specific mechanisms through which change is occurring. Whereas a statistical model is only aiming to assess that there is a relationship between your solution and your intervention. So without saying more, and I know it leaves it a little bit ambiguous, I'm going to talk about my work with mathematical models and trying to figure out if we can get to that 2020 goal, specifically in South Africa, where I've done most of my work. So the UNAIDS goal that I mentioned before is 90, 90, 90, and I'll explain what each of these 90s mean. The first 90 is that we get 90% of those who are HIV positive to know that they're HIV positive, so that we diagnose 90% of those. And then the second 90 is to ensure that 90% of those who know they're HIV positive are put on treatment. And then the third 90 is that 90% of those who are on treatment are virally suppressed, such that they have very little chance of spreading the disease to others. And if you multiply those three 90s, I'll do the math for you, you get 73%. So if we get 90% diagnosed, 90% treated, and 90% suppressed, we'll end up with 73% of all HIV positive people suppressed and unlikely to spread the disease to others. That is the UNAIDS goal, and that's the goal that we saw on the graph in 2020, that very low incidence in 2020. And I have used my model, the HIV calibrated dynamic model, to try to assess if we can get there in South Africa. Here are some previous results that we've shown in the past. The first graph is just showing you that we've been able to replicate the historical epidemic in South Africa from the beginning of the epidemic to 2002, prior to the introduction of antiretroviral therapy. So the data we have is in the stars, and our model is in the colored lines there. We also took the model further to predict the potential for elimination of HIV in South Africa by modeling out 50 years into the future under a variety of different conditions. And so the work that I'm about to tell you about very quickly is about trying to understand the potential for achieving 90-90-90 in South Africa. So let's say we do absolutely nothing, and we just keep doing what we're doing in South Africa. Will we get to 90-90-90? And the reality is that we'll only get to 28% if we keep going the way that we're going. You can see we do pretty well with testing, and we do reasonably well with the rest of the cascade, but when you multiply those out, you get 28%. Let's say we're able to make a 30% increase in our efforts for both testing and treatment in South Africa. Well, we're able to do marginally better, and we're able to get to 44%. But we're still nowhere near the 73% that we're tasked with getting to. If we go 50% harder, then we get to 72%, and we're almost there, right? The goal was 73%, we're at 72%. But if we're full steam ahead with an 80% improvement in our testing and our treatment, we're actually able to get 81% of HIV-positive people suppressed on therapy in South Africa by 2020. So in essence, yes, we can achieve the UN AIDS goals of 73% of HIV-positive people suppressed, but it's going to require an extreme overhaul and increase in our efforts to test and treat people in South Africa. And some data that I didn't show you, but I can tell you about, is that incidence actually doesn't decrease as much as we might want it to or like it to achieve that low red dot on the graph. Now, I'm praising mathematical modeling as the way forward, as a way to avoid the ethical issues that community randomized trials might bring about. But there are quite a few limitations to the modeling work that I do, and I would be amiss not to mention them. First, the predictions that we have are really only as good as the data we put in. And while we have a lot of data about HIV in South Africa specifically, it's not as extensive as we might like it to be in order to properly parameterize our model. Our model also doesn't take into real-life action feedback loops that happen. We don't really take into account the interactions you might have with your neighbor by encouraging them to go get tested or things that might be happening in households. So these feedback loops are not really accounted for in our model. And it's also difficult to incorporate all levels of human behavior. So while we do account for quite a bit of human behavior in our model, it's nearly impossible to account for every decision that a human might make in this situation. So what I hope that I've tried to convey to you is that there are ways that we can do good in epidemiology and in public health. We can do good with community randomized trials as long as we're being cognizant of the ethical issues that might come about. We have horrible examples in our past, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, to encourage us to go down trials, to perform trials in an ethical manner. And we also have other tools like mathematical modeling, which is extremely interdisciplinary. It requires computer science and mathematics and biology, but it's not easy work. So it requires a lot of sort of collaboration, which is sometimes quite difficult, but it's also extremely quantitatively intensive, and that's often difficult to do even with our current advances in technology. So while it's an important exercise for modeling real-life systems, the quality is really determined by the types of data and the assumptions that we use. But I would argue that mathematical modeling is really at the forefront of new questions and trials that are being performed in this field. So I'm going to skip my next few slides because I'm over time, but I'll be happy to take questions during the panel. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here. And I look forward to our conversation and interaction. If we were asked to name the most critical challenges for the survival and flourishing of humankind and of our planet, what would we answer? I hope some would agree that the pursuit of global public health and environmental sustainability are the two most pressing challenges. If we fail to address them, the consequences will be dire for our common home, the Earth, and for our ability of living in it, on it. What is global public health? Global public health seeks to improve health, prevent disease, and achieve health equity for all people in local communities and across the world. Its goal is to end inequities in health that are driven by age, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and geography. Hence, global public health strives to promote what is good and just for humankind. Global public health engages all sectors of society, not only the health sector. Projects in global public health demand collaborative engagements in transnational research and action for promoting health for all. Both locally and globally, the distribution of money, power, services, and resources shapes society, the health systems, and how healthcare is delivered to citizens. We need to consider all the factors intervening, we call them social determinants, that influence health, from education to infrastructures, and that cause the unfair and avoidable differences, inequities in health status seen within and between countries. What is sustainability? Sustainability invites us to reflect on human existence on Earth by considering how economic development bears environmental and social impacts. Sustainable development implies the ability to meet individuals' needs in the current world while protecting sufficient resources to allow future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainability is more than a commodity. It is a good, and it encompasses ecological dimensions with their social and economic implications. Sustainability implies interconnectedness and relationality, and influences moral discernment, decision-making, actions, and practices. As such, it needs to be acknowledged, protected, and promoted as humankind's common good. Sustainability is ethically challenging. It presupposes our ability of analyzing critically how humankind lives today, how we lived in the past, and how we should live in the future if we want to give a chance to the generations that will follow us. Sustainability aims at integral development, as Ambassador Hackett reminded us earlier, and integral development for individuals, for society, and all living creatures and non-living forms, briefly, for the whole planet. Sustainability demands a careful and critical attention to local contexts by understanding how globalization is affecting them and what are the needed structural remedies that will slow the increasing environmental degradation and the human environmental suffering that it causes. Both strengthening global public health and assuring environmental sustainability challenge humankind locally and globally. Hence, both global public health and sustainability demand that we address local concerns as part of a more comprehensive, inclusive, and global pursuit. In other words, we need to define what is good and how we pursue it, both locally and globally. This is controversial. Not everyone agrees that it is possible to define the common good for single individuals, communities, groups, organizations, states, and for the whole world. in ways that are not sectarian and nor biased, and that do not privilege the powerful at the disadvantage of the powerless. Moreover, to affirm that we can define what is good, even for the environment, presupposes our ability of going beyond our narrow anthropocentric approach, where our concerns end with the needs of human beings. The pursuit of the common good presupposes that our anthropocentric approach is integrated by biocentric and even cosmocentric dimensions. If it is truly inclusive, the common good is not only for human beings, but also for all living creatures, for non-living forms, and for the whole planet. What is the common good? The common good allows the ultimate realization of individual capacities in the social context, and it concerns individuals, groups, and the whole earth. The common good aims at individual and collective flourishing, whether we focus on human beings or on the rest of creation. In a world marred by social, economic, and political inequities, whether in the North, global North, or in the global South, the common good aims at promoting social justice. In the case of human beings, the common good includes all social goods, spiritual, moral, and even material, that human beings pursue on earth according to personal and social needs. The common good aims at achieving a social coexistence characterized by authentic solidarity, which implies the readiness to serve those who, in civil society, have greater needs and are less advantaged. For Catholic theological discourse, this is the preferential option for the poor, and it aims at promoting those who are currently excluded, marginalized, or socially disadvantaged because of their economic or educational status, their gender or race, their religion or belief system. By making a preferential option for the poor, the common good strives to achieve greater equality by requiring a resolute commitment to reduce and to eliminate inequities and their causes. As Professor Lisa Cale in the Theology department stresses, the common good requires justice, order, peace, social welfare, and equal access to all people to basic necessities and to a variety of social goods, among them education, environmental innovation, and innovative research, scientific research. Finally, the common good depends both on rational reflection on human experience, independently of any cultural, religious, linguistic, social, and political difference, and at the same time on Christian faith, with its concern for the good of everyone and everything. Who is responsible for promoting the common good? In Catholic social thought, political authorities are primarily responsible for the common good. It is their duty to protect and promote the common good of all citizens. At the same time, it is not up to states alone to pursue and to realize the common good. Individual citizens, groups, and civil organizations have social responsibilities and contribute to the common good. In the current globalized and pluralist context, the whole civil society is responsible for promoting the common good. Hence, the common good demands subsidiarity between state institutions, groups, ecclesial organizations, and citizens. Many citizens and associations, for example, are committed to promote global public health and to promote the quality of life on Earth by preserving ecosystems and by avoiding irreversible climate changes. To the cynics and to the skeptics who argue that it is impossible to define the common good and to pursue it, we can reply that many people are already committed to promote the common good in multiple contexts in very concrete ways. Of course, much more should be done. What do we need to do? In today's world, to promote the common good demands an imbalance in favor of the less advantaged and of those that have been and continue to be defrauded of opportunities, goods, respect, rights, and freedom, and whose human, social, and cultural progress is hindered by multiple violations, serious omissions, and complicity. In the field of health, the common good presupposes the right to health and the right to development for every citizen and society, regardless of difference of income, education, beliefs, and social location. Here at Boston College, the current environmental studies, the courses in global public health that are offered by the schools of education, nursing, and social work, and the minor and major in global public health that are in the planning stages, are examples of how our university wants to train future leaders and practitioners who will be creatively engaged in promoting global health and sustainability. Moreover, our Center for Human Rights and International Justice highlights our commitment to promote rights. And finally, the Schiller Institute will expand our engagement in promoting global health, global public health, and sustainability. To live in sustainable ways, creativity, ingenuity, and innovation are essential. For example, we need to produce energy efficiently in alternative ways. The research that is taking place here at BC in the physics department to use nanotechnology to build efficient solar cells is an inspiring example. Moreover, we need to reduce and eliminate pollution, as it is stressed by the recent important report that is the fruit of the leadership of Philip Landrigan, with the collaboration of Tom Childs and Gautam Yadama, the Dean of the School of Social Work. Pope Francis added his own authoritative voice to promote just sustainability. In his 2015 encyclical letter Laudato Si, on the care of our common home, Pope Francis affirms that integral ecology is inseparable from the notion of the common good. The common good leads to respect human beings by promoting human rights and the just integral development. Moreover, for Pope Francis, the common good calls for social peace, solidarity, and the preferential option for the poorest of our sisters and brothers. In conclusion, to identify what is the common good of our planet is a demanding process. We strive to define it and then pursue it for humankind and for all creatures on earth. To address the multiple inequities that globally afflict us, political leadership and political compromises, as well as structural and institutional changes, are needed. Searching for the common good requires dialogue and collaboration by listening to each other, particularly to the missing voices of those who are marginalized and excluded because of their race, gender, and social location. The common good presupposes citizens and institutions striving to live and act in virtuous ways by caring for what is good for them and for the whole planet, as James Kearns in the Theology department reminds us. Being engaged to promote the common good requires a personal and collective conversion, as Paul Farmer stresses. For Christians, it implies recognizing health and the earth as God's gifts entrusted to humankind. Global public health and sustainability are complex problems, and they raise enduring questions, just to echo what we are trying to do in the core curriculum. Christian hope trusts that humanity is able to promote the common good by fostering global public health and sustainable life on earth. Thank you for your attention.
That's a long title to a fairly obvious problem. And the problem is illustrated on this graph. And simply put, it's the achievement gap. This happens to be in the state of Massachusetts, and the data is from the statewide math test, the MCAS. But any state you go to, and Massachusetts, as you know, is at the top of the educational achievement category in our country. Any state you go to, you see a similar pattern. The top line shows us the percentage of students proficient or above across the entire state. Notice, if you can, there's a 31% percentage of students who are low income across the state of Massachusetts. So that data in that line includes all of the cities and towns, all of the students in Massachusetts. The bottom of the broken line is scores proficient or above on the same test from the city of Boston, Boston Public Schools, where the percentage of low-income children is 83%. The slide really tells us not just about the achievement gap, but it tells us pretty dramatically that zip code is destiny when it comes to the achievement of our school-aged kids. The focus of all of the federal and local efforts to address this problem have been to date on improving classroom teaching and instruction, a very important thing to do. And accountability, you know, you've read in the papers about all of the testing that's done, but the accountability has really addressed some of the equity issue in our country in terms of our educational system, the high-stakes testing. But even though we all had high expectations for the legislation around improving academic achievement, remember the days when we thought it was going to be all done? The legislation said by 2014, the achievement gap would be closed. Well, we haven't even come close. And why not? The reason we're not close is that the achievement gap can't simply be explained by differences in teaching and classroom instruction. About 1/3 of the gap can be explained by that set of issues. 2/3 of the gap is due to the out-of-school challenges that impact children living in poverty. And those are pretty serious challenges. Communities that are racked by violence, families that are racked by substance abuse, homelessness, you can name it. It's the myriad of social issues that we know are related to poverty. The research is very clear about the 1/3, 2/3 difference, and how we explain the achievement gap has to take into account, and how we address it has to take into account the 2/3 that's due to these social issues. So at Boston College, around 99, 2000, a group of faculty decided to address this. And we did it by forming a research practice partnership. And the members of the group on the left-hand side, we engaged in a 2-year co-design process to see if we could figure out a solution for schools, one solution, not all solutions, but one solution that would address the out-of-school challenges that impact the kids that arrive at the school doors every day. Boston College obviously was a lead participant with the Boston Public Schools, the community agencies in the city, and I'll explain why they were important, and obviously families. And some of you involved in those early efforts are sitting here. Amanda Soto from social work. Over the years, and it's now been about 16, but we've had 10 years where we were able to get really good data from Boston schools so that we could examine the impact of the intervention that we developed. And we worked collaboratively with the Center for the Study of Educational Testing, Evaluation, and Educational Policy. You get A in the Lynch School if you can remember that acronym, CSTE. In addressing this issue, we brought together a team of folks from across the university, really, and across the city of Boston, because the problem of poverty is obviously pretty complex. You cannot deal with it coming from the perspective of one discipline. So we had a number, and I want to mention that the person who led the co-design effort was from the field of public health. And so what we eventually developed was what we call a public health / clinical model, because we wanted to address not just the challenges of the kids in schools who are presenting the most serious problems to teachers, the kids that, were, quote, trouble kids for a teacher. We really wanted to take a look at how can we address these challenges for all kids. And these professions and disciplines were really essential to make something happen. We grounded it in developmental science, and in the last 20 years, this field has really exploded with terrific research on fundamentally how do humans develop. And so we grounded the intervention in this with the assumption that looks like a kind of obviosity up there, every child is unique, but really there's a lot of scientific research now that shows that we all have unique developmental pathways. The development occurs across many domains at the same time: academic, social, emotional, health, family, spiritual, career. There's all kinds of pathways that we're developing. Strengths and risks co-act. This really has begun to be understood in the last 20 years in developmental science, that strengths and risks, and we all have a bundle of both, they don't just interact, they co-act. They act on each other. They don't compensate. You can't have 10 strengths, 10 risks, and say, oh, good, I'm even, and it's going to work. But you have to have the right combination of strengths and risks. And lots of the children that we work with in the schools all have strengths. Many have really horrific risks in their lives to deal with. Development is impacted by context, and that's kind of an obviosity. And the last one is what really powered our engines. We know now from developmental science that the life course can be altered by the right interventions. And that sounds pretty dramatic, but we literally have the power to change the course of development if we create the right set of conditions. And the trick is figuring out the right set of conditions. So schools have been aware for a long time. If you ask any teacher, they've known for years that poverty challenges kids and challenges their learning. And so what they thought about, particularly in the late 90s, was schools can't do this all by themselves. They used to say teachers aren't social workers, teachers aren't nurses. So let's bring all the community agencies together. There are lots of services, there are lots of enrichment opportunities for kids in the city. With Boston right now, we're working with 365 community agencies. There's lots of them. Let's bring them to the schools and all will be well. But they had a major problem, because if you bring too many to a school, you create chaos. If you don't bring the right ones to the schools, you're not able to connect the child to the right resources. There's nobody to manage it in the school. Busy principals are trying to deal with teaching and instruction and MCAS. And so how do you organize this? But more critically, the real issue is how do you get the right service or support to the right child at the right time? It takes somebody who's got a relationship with that child, who knows who that child is, who knows what his developmental challenges are, and can say, it's this service, it's an after-school program, it's a tutor, it's a dentist, that this is what this child needs. So we organized services, but most importantly, the intervention that was co-designed put a person inside the school. The most important part of this slide is in the middle. We put an adult in there, a master's trained school counselor or a school social worker, who literally got to know every child in that school and worked with the teacher to develop a plan for that child. And the plan that we developed, we call this the bicycle slide. It's very scientific. But the plan we developed basically has this coordinator, school counselor or social worker, meeting every year in the fall of the year with each classroom teacher for about an hour. Go through every child by name. What are this child's challenges? What are this child's strengths? Let's build a plan to help support this child. For example, the kind of plan I mentioned. If a child has much more serious problems that you can't address in an hour, then you do an individual meeting with that child at a little bit later time and with the family. But in the meantime, you talk to families, you talk to community agencies, you put a plan in motion, and then you record it. You go back 8 weeks later, you say to the teacher, how is the child doing? You make sure that all those referrals are done, the child is actually getting the services. So it's not enough to say, here's what you need. Gee, Mom, why don't you get this for Johnny? It's in the school, we actually do that work of getting the parental permission, working with the community agency, and getting the child into an appropriate plan. Those are some of the services, the prevention services, the early intervention, and the intensive. We use technology. We built a database to record a plan, a student support plan, for every single child in the school. And it has child-level information, it has personalized the plan for the child, and then it has information about all of those 365 agencies in the case of Boston, and who the contact person is, what services they provide. That's all embedded in the database, so somebody in the school, the coordinator, can make a quick connection for that child and actually make the referral. We use implementation science. We developed a way to measure fidelity of implementation. What that means in the short run is that we can actually determine if the plan is being implemented at any school in the way that it was intended. Because if the plan isn't being implemented the way it was intended and the intervention isn't being implemented, there's no point in measuring outcomes. So we developed a fidelity system. I won't go into the details. Anybody interested, and I'm happy to explain it. So the big question is, after we did all this, does it work? Does it make any difference for kids and families? And we have a data set that's now about 16 years old. It goes back 16 years. We've been able to follow the same children from kindergarten through high school. We have about 50,000 students in the database, and we have a whole team for external review. Remember the problem, the achievement gap that we started with? This is what happens. City Connect's children in City Connect schools are in blue. Boston Public Schools that are not in City Connects are in red. So we had a control group, and the state is still at the top. But look at the change in the children in blue. And those children essentially are the same kids. They're actually matched as the children in the red line, except the blue line gets the intervention. And it's pretty dramatic. That's the math MCAS test. We see something similar for ELL students. It's particularly effective for ELL students. And what's interesting about this data is that City Connects only went up to grade 5 in these particular schools. It was the way the schools were designed, K-5. What you're seeing is after they leave the intervention schools in grades 6, 7, and 8, look at the dramatic increase. So the intervention seems to have a lasting effect, which is not anything that we predicted. We would have been happy if it affected the kids while they were in the intervention. We see the same kinds of results in terms of lowering chronic absenteeism. That's kids that are absent 10 days or more from school. Again, a lower rate for City Connect schools. The same thing for being held back in grade, and you know what a big predictor that is for dropout, especially grade 9. And then when we had the great pleasure of looking at these kids who had been 12 years in our database. And what do we find in high school? Half the rate of dropout. City Connects, kids that had been City Connects in the first 5 grades. So they're now 7 years away from the intervention, and the effects of the intervention have lasted. And we looked at 2 particular subgroups that were big concerns for the public schools, the black males and the Latino males, and we see exactly the same results there. We've looked at this data a million ways. These are some of the methodological strategies that we've used, the statisticians out there, although we haven't done mathematical modeling on it. But the statisticians will recognize these different methods, but the findings are very robust. Every year we do anonymous satisfaction surveys, because if nobody likes it in the schools, you better not be doing it. And you can see that teachers who seldom agree on much in terms of interventions that come into the school, because they've had so many, the rate of satisfaction is pretty high. Same with community partners, same with principals. Columbia asked us about doing a cost-benefit study, and we participated in that. If you look at the return on investment of this particular intervention, and you consider the cost of all the services that the kids get, and in Boston, they include health services, family services, social emotional counseling. Some of them are high-cost services in this city. The return on investment is 3 to 1. Now, we're not paying for the services. That they're usually insurance-supported or philanthropically supported. But if you don't consider the cost of the services, which is how most of these interventions calculate their cost-benefit ratio, the return on investment is 11 to 1. And that's pretty dramatic for an intervention like this. City Connects is now in 5 states. We're in 12 school districts. We're in public, private, and charter schools. We're in Catholic schools in Boston. We're in 37 schools, 21 are Boston public schools in the city. And last year, just in Boston, it was 9,000 students with 47,000 services. That's a lot of support, with 380 community partners. And the map on the right shows you all of the community agencies in the city. We have not implemented this model in a rural setting because there the services and supports are much more limited, but we're ready to tangle with that because we have some ideas. Some of the publications that have come out of this and our funders, both government funders and philanthropic support has been significant. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.